Hi everyone, I'm RKurian, a senior at Dulles High School, and today I will be talking to you about replacing bone with foam, the future of cadaver testing. My mentor was Mr. Tyler Touche, senior R&D engineer at DJO Surgical, and I got a lot of help from Ms. Bryant, GTM mentorship specialist as well. So just briefly what I'm going to be talking about, first I will be introducing you to the composition of bone. I'll briefly touch on surgical devices, and then I'll get into the pros and cons of both cadaver testing and the use of polyurethane foam. Then I'll touch on 4 different studies that I took a look at in my research. And finally, I'll discuss with you conclusions and future research. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is that bone is alive. Bone is made up of living tissue, just like our heart and our eyes, even though it might not always seem like it. So bone is mostly made up of inorganic material called mineralized matrix, and most of this mineralized matrix is made up of hydroxyapatite, which you can see here on the left side. So this hydroxyapatite allows for bone to withstand loads exerted on it without deforming, and this is a property known as stiffness. Of course, with inorganic material comes organic material. The organic material of bone is mostly made up of collagen. Collagen is a commonly found protein in our bodies, and it allows for bone to deform without fracturing, and this property is known as toughness. So that's what you're seeing here on your right side. These images are pictures of collagen from the bones of rats. And these 2 labels, cortical and trabecular, are 2 different types of bone tissue that I will get into very shortly. So just to make it a little bit easier to understand these 2 mechanical properties, I mentioned that the inorganic material of bone allows for the bone to be stiff. As you can see here, this material does not deform or bend under the weight of this load, as opposed to a flexible material which does bend under the load. And here on the other side, you can see the property of toughness. Here, this tough material will deform but not fracture under this load, while a brittle material will fracture under the load of the hammer. So both of these properties allow for bone to form and maintain the structure of the human body while still responding to forces without fracturing. And of course, the mineralized matrix and the organic material of bone do not remain apart. The hydroxyapatite fills in the collagen network. As you can see here, this is what the collagen network would look like. And then these fibers created by the hydroxyapatite and the collagen combined are arranged to create layers that make up our bone. And that's actually what you're seeing here on your right side. This is mineralized collagen, so basically the hydroxyapatite filling in the collagen network to create our bone. So I mentioned that there are 2 different types of bone, cortical bone tissue, cortical and cancellous bone. And the difference between these 2 tissues is porosity. Cancellous bone is definitely more porous than cortical bone. And that is something that you can see here in this middle image, that trabecular bone, or this is another name for cancellous bone, excuse me, that trabecular bone has a lot more pores and is less ordered than cortical bone. And cortical bone surrounds cancellous bone, something you can see on both your left and right. Compact bone here is another name for cortical bone. Spongy bone is another name for cancellous bone. So you can see how the compact bone envelops the spongy bone both here and over here, same concept, the compact tissue surrounding the cancellous tissue. The cortical bone has a low porosity, like I just mentioned, along with a high mineral density, and both of these properties allow for cortical bone to have the property of hardness, which we typically attribute to bone. And cancellous bone or trabecular bone has a high porosity, and that allows for this bone tissue to relieve sudden stresses exerted on it. And these pores also usually contain bone marrow and blood vessels. So of course, our bones are not perfect. They can still fracture and be damaged, which is why we've created surgical devices like screws, plates, and intramedullary nails. And these devices help support our bone in supporting our bodies. So that's some of the things that you can see here. On the left side, you can see a screw inserted into, actually, this is the big toe. And kind of the same concept on the right side, except for in this picture, you can see a plate sitting on the outside of the big toe with screws going into the big toe. And of course, we don't implant these devices into living beings without testing them first. We conduct biomechanical testing on these devices, typically in cadavers. So I mentioned that we tested these devices in cadavers because the internal structure of cadavers matches very well with living bone, of course, because cadavers were once living. However, there are a couple of different issues that arise with cadaver testing. One of the first issues is that bone properties tend to vary across cadavers, of course, because not all of us are created, all of us are not created exactly the same, which means that our bones, cadaver bones tend to behave differently, which makes it difficult for researchers to compare data both within their experiment and amongst different experiments, different trials. And also another issue that researchers have seen is that a lot of the ages of cadavers typically represent the elderly population. As you can see here, the lowest age within the study was of the cadavers was age 49, and the highest was 91. Here on the left, you can kind of see the same thing. The lowest age was about 54, 56, and the highest age was 71. And here on the right, same concept, you can see that the peak age of the cadavers collected was about 70 years. So of course, the elderly population does not necessarily represent the total population. However, if these tests were designed to glean the performance of these devices in damaged bone, this might not be as much of an issue. So another issue that comes up with cadaver testing is, of course, preservation. Cadavers need to be preserved before, during, and after testing or use. And traditionally, scientists will use formalin-based solutions, which are known to harden soft tissues and thus impact the biomechanical properties and their performance during testing. Of course, like I mentioned, cadavers need to be preserved throughout testing and even afterward, making them expensive to use and maintain. So because of this, researchers have been working to identify a model that behaves similarly enough for testing on these models to be appropriate. So essentially, they're looking for a replacement to cadavers. And one promising material is polyurethanes. So my project seeks to answer this question. Are polyurethane foam models a good replacement for cadavers in biomechanical testing? So what are polyurethanes? Polyurethanes were created in the 1930s, around the beginning of World War II, and they quickly spread to many different applications. Polyurethanes are a special type of chemical used to make a variety of products that we use every day, which you can see here, everything from your yoga mat to your Tempur-Pedic mattress to even your sponges. And they have been introduced to biomechanical testing as well as an alternative to cadaver testing. So there are a couple different pros to using polyurethane foams in testing. One of them is that there are endless types of polyurethane foams. So polyurethane foams are created by mixing diisocyanate with polyols, and both of these are products of crude oil. So adding different chemicals to the mix allows for different properties to come up in these different foams, which allows for the endless types of foam. Of course, these foams are also way cheaper and easier to store compared to cadavers, and they also lack the ethical concerns surrounding cadaver testing. And because these polyurethane foams are created almost exactly the same, machine-made, there's less variation in the behavior of these polyurethane foams during testing, making it easier for scientists to reproduce the experiments, the results from the experiments again. However, the unique structure of bone makes it, of course, difficult to produce the same structure in polyurethane foam. And along with that, the soft tissues around our bone play an important role in how the device that is inserted into our bodies functions. And of course, these polyurethane foam models don't have these same soft tissues, which definitely impacts the performance of polyurethane foam during testing. So these pros and cons are what researchers try to balance as they choose how to conduct their testing. So next I'm going to jump into some of the studies that I took a look at. I wasn't able to conduct an experiment, but I used Google Scholar to research studies comparing the performance of polyurethane foams and cadavers to determine how close the two are in behavior, which would ultimately lead to an answer to my research question. I was able to take a look at a variety of different studies that I'll be discussing 4 here with you that helped me reach my conclusion. So the first study that I wanted to talk to you about, this team, for the sake of not butchering their names, I won't read off their last names, but this team took a look at the stress-strain relationship of polyurethane foam. So from this relationship, engineers are typically able to determine the properties of the material. And actually the stress-strain curve of the polyurethane foam they tested is over here on the right. So you can see where the polyurethane foam behaves perfectly elastic right here in this linear region. And perfectly elastic basically means that if the material is subject to a load, the material will bend under the load, but once the load is removed, it'll return back to its original structure. And then we can also see where the material begins to deform under the load as well in this region. So this graph was the authors determined that this graph matched the stress-strain relationship of cancellous bone, at least with regards to elasticity and deformation, meaning that the polyurethane foam behavior matched very well with cancellous bone. However, the authors of the study also tested the response of the polyurethane foam to shear forces, and they determined that the results didn't match cancellous bone, making the testing of shear properties on polyurethane foams inappropriate. And of course, the authors encouraged that cadaver bones be used when possible, because these bones best model the true structure of living bone. But they noted that if reproducibility is valued over accuracy, especially when cost is an issue, polyurethane foam would be a great choice. And just something I'd like to note here, I mentioned earlier that adding different chemicals to polyurethane foam can change the properties of the foam. And similarly, altering the density of the foam can alter the modulus value. And modulus is basically a property that describes the ability or the willingness of resistance of an object to deform. So basically, by altering the density of the polyurethane foam, the scientists can control the response of the polyurethane foam to a load. And ultimately, this is important because not all bones behave exactly the same, of course. So when researchers are choosing the polyurethane foam model to use during testing, they would be able to choose a density of foam that best matches the properties of the bone that the device will be inserted into. So I was able to take a look at another study that covered the shear properties of rigid polyurethane foam, and the study was conducted by the team here at the bottom. So they used 4 different grades of sawbones. Sawbones are basically rigid polyurethane foams. And they ultimately concluded that the elastic properties of polyurethane foam match that of cancellous bone. However, the difference in failure properties was significant. Therefore, these authors concluded that the testing of failure properties of polyurethane foam and projecting these results onto cancellous bone would be inappropriate. So I've actually included a table at the bottom here. And you can see that the shear properties of rigid polyurethane foam don't completely match that of trabecular bone in this study. But the authors noted that it's important that you address the fact that the polyurethane foam models can be altered based on the chemicals added to them, allowing for the foams to better fit the trabecular bone ranges. Therefore, the authors concluded that the shear properties would be the shear properties of the polyurethane foam match that of the trabecular bone. And this was an interesting study to me because I realized that the conclusion of shear properties of rigid polyurethane foam didn't match that of the last study. So this indicates that, of course, more research should be done to determine whether shear properties do definitively match that of cancellous bone. So I was able to take a look at another team, and what was unique about the study was that they tested both polyurethane foam blocks and osteoporotic femoral heads. And the goal was to determine whether these foam blocks would be appropriate models for the osteoporotic femoral heads. So osteoporosis is basically where, as you get older, the creation of new bone doesn't keep up with that of old bone, with the removal of old bone, excuse me. So there were 2 different foam blocks of densities, different densities. Block A had a density of 0.16 grams per centimeter cubed, and block B had a density of 0.08 grams per centimeter cubed, and these were tested against the femoral heads. So 2 different device implants were tested in this study, a dynamic hip screw and a dynamic hip screw blade. So push-out testing was conducted on both the bone and the foam, and force and displacement were measured during the testing. And actually, you can see the setup for push-out testing here. And the results from the study are on the right here. So as you can see, block A performed relatively well, and its behavior was comparable to that of the femoral heads, especially in the trial where they conducted the push-out testing with the dynamic hip screw blade implant. So the authors of the study concluded that block A would be a good model for researchers to use when testing these devices in, as opposed to using osteoporotic femoral heads, they would be able to use density of 0.16 grams per centimeter cubed polyurethane foam. However, the authors of the study definitely cautioned against assuming that the rigid polyurethane foam behaves exactly like the cadaveric femoral heads. Of course, because of the complex internal structure of the osteoporotic femoral heads, that doesn't necessarily match that of the polyurethane foam. And ultimately, they believe that the foam would need to undergo more testing to validate the results. So finally, I was able to take a look at another team that also compared their rigid polyurethane foam blocks to osteoporotic bones. And the researchers created 3.9 and 7.7 millimeter cylinders of polyurethane foam of 3 different densities and cell types. So the 0.09 grams per centimeter cube polyurethane foam was open-celled in order to model very low density cancellous bone. And then there were 2 other densities, 0.16 grams per centimeter cubed and 0.32 grams per centimeter cubed. And these foam blocks were closed-celled to model low and medium density cancellous bone, respectively. So compression testing was conducted on all models of foam, and that's what you're seeing here on the left side. So they tested for the Young's modulus and yield strength. So Young's modulus shows us the elastic behavior of the material and can be calculated by solving for the slope here in this linear region of the stress strain curve. And you can also see the yield strength on this curve as well. The yield strength is the point at which the material begins to deform plastically under the load. Basically, by plastic deformation, I mean that when a load is exerted on the material will deform, and when the load is removed from the material will still stay in that deformed state. It will not return back to its original state. So, like I said before, this is also measured off of the stress strain curve. So here's the data that they got from their testing. I'm including both the data from the 3.9 length and the 7.7 length for all 3 densities, as well as the known values for the osteoporotic cancellous bone and normal cancellous bone. So the researchers used known values as references to compare the results from their study. They did not actually conduct testing on osteoporotic cancellous bone and normal cancellous bone. So as you can see here, the behavior of the foam block with a density of 0.09 grams per centimeter cubed, none of these values here really matched that of the osteoporotic cancellous bone. The foam density was too weak to match this bone type. And really none of the values here seem to match that of these 2 values here, either the osteoporotic cancellous bone or the normal cancellous bone. But the authors made an important note that the values of the Young's modulus and yield strength tend to vary very much in literature, which is why I've included a range here that I found from different studies for normal cancellous bone. So the authors concluded that the foam blocks with the density of 0.16 and 0.32 grams per centimeter cubed, of course, have values that fall within this range listed below here. Which would mean that these 2 densities would be appropriate as models for testing. And the authors concluded that the 0.32 grams per centimeter cubed foam model was best suited for testing because it best matched not only the ranges listed here at the bottom, but also the values that they got from literature that they studied as well. So as you'll see in the data, the values for the 3.9 millimeter length and the 7.7 millimeter length definitely vary between the 2. So the authors made an important note that the dimensions of the foam model should really match that of the bone that will be that the device will be implanted into, just to ensure accuracy during testing. So finally, I'll just briefly touch on some of the conclusions and further research. So this was just a summary of the properties of polyurethane foam that generally aligned with that of cancellous bone. versus those that did not align with cancellous bone. And this is a compilation of all the properties through all the different studies that I was able to take a look at, though for the sake of time, I only discussed 4 with you. So some of the properties that generally aligned with that of cancellous bone was for the failure properties, compressive strength and modulus, and Young's modulus and yield strength, which came from the stress strain curve. And properties that generally did not align with that of cancellous bone include shear properties. And we saw studies where the results contradicted, so of course further research would need to be conducted to determine definitively whether these properties do match or don't match with that of cancellous bone. So finally, a few conclusions. So this first conclusion comes from my summary slide just before, that polyurethane foam would be an appropriate model for testing the following parameters here, and this came from my list on the previous slide. My second conclusion is that density and open closed celled would need to matched according to the population that the device is being made for. So essentially what I mean by that is that the density and whether this polyurethane foam is open or closed celled definitely matters when choosing which model you're using of the foam, so that the properties of the foam will best match that of the bone that the device will be inserted to, of course, in living humans. So this gives researchers some more control and allows them to conduct more accurate testing if they select models with different densities and cell types that best match the bone that ultimately will be used for the device. Finally, my third conclusion is that testing on shear strength and modulus should be conducted on cadavers, of course, because research has not definitively concluded whether the shear properties of polyurethane foam match that of cancellous foam. And this is actually a conclusion that I just touched on, that the polyurethane foam model dimension should match that of the bone to be tested on, because like we saw before, with the 3.9 and 7.7 cylinders having different properties, just to ensure that the foam behaves as closely as possible to the bone that will be ultimately that the device will be inserted into, the dimensions should very much match that of the bone that will ultimately be used for the device to be inserted into. And finally, of course, cadaver testing is still definitely very relevant, not only to determine the anatomical structural accuracy, but also for the testing of some properties like shear strength and modulus. And by anatomical structural accuracy, I put this phrase in there for the sake of being concise, but what I mean by that is that when you insert the device into the body, of course, you don't want the device poking out or not really fitting well in the body, in the structure. So cadaver testing is a great option for making sure that the device fits very well in the human body. Finally, just briefly, some future research. So researchers have actually been coming up with computer modeling in order to test devices. So instead of using cadavers or even polyurethane foams, computer modeling has been developed and is being tested against the performance of polyurethane foams and cadaver testing as well. Polyurethane foams are also being created with soft tissue structures. And of course, this is definitely a great step, but brings up the question of whether these soft tissue structures behave similarly to the soft tissues that are found in our bodies. And finally, cadaver preservation techniques. If researchers can find a cadaver preservation technique that doesn't impact the cadavers as much as traditional formulas, such as formalin-based solutions, then researchers might be able to use these techniques in order to test cadavers and have their properties more accurately reflect that of living bone tissue. Here are my references. Okay, thank you so much. I really want to thank Fort Bend for allowing me to do this work, DJO for giving me their time, especially Mr. Touche, and Ms. Bryan for supporting me through this project and connecting me with Mr. Touche. Thank you.